Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
Hey, and I'm Brian.
And this is the
Bible Bistro.
Of course.
You didn't sing it. I didn't sing it that time.
I didn't.
So.
Well, I like to mix it up. I like to keep it spicy around here.
Yeah, I never know what you're going to do, so.
That's true. That's true. And I never know what you're going to call me.
Right.
Or whose name you're going to call me.
Fair point.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Brian, welcome back to Bistro. It's so glad to be back here.
Yeah, it's good to be back. And it's, the third season now. And we've actually got our first guest of the third season.
Yes, we do.
I don't know if you knew that or not. It's a privilege.
Yes, it is. We've had some wonderful guests, but Brian, introduce us to our guest today.
This is Jody Owens, Dr. Jody Owens, who's actually been recommended to us by a couple of our longtime listeners. He does some learning retreats. In fact, he's got one coming up on 1 Samuel. So we're asking him, or it's actually on the David narratives, right? Am I saying that
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so he's got one of those coming up, and so we've asked him to talk a little bit about some of how we should understand 1 and 2 Samuel and David, and he's going to do some really cool things with that. But Jody, it's good to have you with us on the Bistro.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, great to be here, and gosh, what a privilege to be the first guest in the third season.
The third
yeah.
season.
Yeah.
Well,
so
who knows?
That's outstanding.
There may be some other first you get. I don't know.
You get a bronze medal.
All right. I'll take it. I'll
you get
take
something.
it. Yeah,
anyway, So just tell us a little bit about yourself, Jody, so our listeners can know who you are and what you do and that kind of thing. So.
Yeah. I grew up in South Georgia, but I've been living in East Tennessee now for about 30 years. So I guess I'm an East Tennessee boy, and came up here originally to study for ministry. And worked on a master's degree at Johnson University. And the best thing that came out of that is that I met my wife here. And we settled down some roots. And I went into to preaching ministry and was a pastor for 10 years. And thought that was going to be the trajectory of my life. All of my graduate training was practical training. An MDiv and a DMin and an MA in preaching, and thought that was going to be my life. And then I got a call one day from Johnson University, and they asked me to teach some courses. And that went well enough that they asked me if I would be interested in going on full time. And I really had never thought about, I hadn't planned for that. I think in my heart of hearts, I'm still a pastor. But I thought this would be a unique opportunity to train pastors. Sure. So I transitioned to teaching at Johnson University, and I'm kind of the utility guy. I've taught a little bit of everything, but mostly in Bible and theology in the area of Old Testament. And then at the graduate level, I teach spiritual formation courses, and I've been doing that for 20 years. And so, we've lived here on campus at Johnson. This is the only life my 17-year-old daughter has known, and it's been
Very
good.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. So how long you've been teaching again? What'd you say? How long?
20 years.
20 years, wow.
Full time. Yeah, I had about 4 years of adjunct work before that. And, it's interesting. I thought when I started teaching at Johnson that my 10 years of ministry experience was really good preparation to teach at a place that trained ministers and missionaries, and it was. Right. But now I'm realizing after 20 years in academia that my 20 years in academia has actually been good preparation to minister to ministers, because I've had time to. I've had 20 years to reflect on 10 years of ministry, and nobody in ministry gets that privilege. You've got to do the next thing. So, that's kind of a season in life where I am, where I'm trying to pour back into Christian leaders.
Yeah, we'll hear some more about that a little bit later. I'm excited to hear about that too. So. Now you said haven't you done a degree in church history as well, or did I misunderstand that?
No, that's right. Yeah, my MDiv has a church history concentration, and my master's thesis was on John Wesley's missionary journey to Georgia, and it was pretty exciting. I'm from Savannah, where he served, and so I was able to dig into some of those old diaries and things that a lot of folks really haven't explored much. So that was fun.
Right. So when you say you're kind of a utility player, you teach all kinds of different courses, but primarily now you focus Old Testament theology and Christian spirituality.
Yeah. I
Okay.
usually teach 3 undergraduate Old Testament courses each semester.
Okay.
And my grad work is all in spiritual formation, but my undergrad's Old Testament for the most part.
Okay, very cool. Well, you've got a retreat coming up, and in fact, I'll go ahead and say Ryan and I are planning to be a part of this. We're excited about it. You're talking about the David narratives in 1st and 2nd Samuel at the retreat. It's a learning retreat. Going to be in southern Indiana at a really nice retreat center there. So we asked you to come and kind of tell us a little bit. We said, what are some things that might be really interesting about that material? And you teach that in college as well, or seminary?
We've got a course that is designed to introduce students to biblical narrative, especially Old Testament narrative. And so we've got one course in Genesis. I teach this one over the books of Samuel.
Okay.
We're developing a couple of others, but we're trying to hit the high points in the narrative. And really, I think, goodness, if you're looking at Old Testament stories, to understand Christianity, you've got to know the story of Abraham, you've got to know the story of Moses, and you've got to know the story of David.
That's true.
And so I've taught this course on the David narratives for about 4 years now, and I didn't know what I didn't know about Samuel until I started to develop an entire course on it. I had taught units in some of our other courses, but goodness, I just it's not until you take a deep dive that you realize how rich material really is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, give us
that's everything. I think for conversations Brian and I have had on here is like, I didn't know what I didn't know. And it's learning from people that have dove into the scripture and to see that stuff. It's really kind of helps unlock those things. So I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to say. Excited to hear. So give us a couple of nuggets. What did you find out when you started digging into the scriptures there?
Well, one thing I knew from teaching introductory courses, but really came to appreciate at a deeper level, was just paying attention to the type of literature that we have. And most Protestants think of books like Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings as being historical narrative.
Right.
And they are, but they're a particular kind of narrative. And what really helps us with this, I think, is understanding the way the Jews saw this material. In the Jewish canon, in the Jewish Bible, their Bible is basically divided into 3 parts. There's the Tanakh, which is the acronym for the entire Jewish Bible, and the T in Tanakh stands for Torah. So that's the first 5 books, what we would call the Pentateuch.
Right.
The N in Tanakh stands for the Nevi'im, that's the prophets. And then the third section is the Ketuvim, the writings is the way we would translate that. So the Jewish Bible is made up of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And right off the bat, you notice there's not a section called the history books.
Right. Right.
And so you ask, well, where does a book like Samuel fit? And I ask my students this, and they're all surprised to find out that the book of Samuel fits into the section known as the prophets.
Prophets, yeah.
It's in that center section. And more specifically, it's grouped together with 4 other books that are really kind of viewed as a package, like 4 volumes that go together. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Those books are called the former prophets.
Okay.
And then you have the latter prophets, which are books that we more typically think of as being prophetic. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12, which is the minor prophets. So we get that those books would fit in there, but we sometimes fail to realize that the Jews thought of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings as in some way being prophetic.
Right.
Maybe a better way to say it, because that word prophetic is loaded for us.
Right.
The Old Testament folk, both the authors and the readers, understood prophecy not primarily as predicting the future, but primarily looking at their context and seeing where Israel was or was not being faithful to the covenant. We would call that preaching. You point right. You point out where the people are being faithful and where they're being unfaithful.
Okay. So kind of prophetic in the sense of saying, here are the things we need to straighten out, kind of thing.
That's right. That's right. And so that history is recorded from that prophetic theological perspective.
Interesting. Okay.
It's different from the kind of history that we read. We're interested in things like chronology. We're interested in things like making sure all the facts line up, precisely. Whereas the biblical authors, the biblical prophets who wrote this material, they're more interested in writing in such a way that their audience is deeply formed by what they've read. Okay. They're less interested in a precise chronological kind of accounting.
Sure.
And so there are all kinds of implications of that.
Okay, so they might arrange material in a different way for it to have a different kind of impact. Okay.
For sure. And you see that especially in a book like Judges, which pretty clearly has a thematic arrangement and not a strictly chronological arrangement. But that's also true in Samuel.
Yeah, we can't take a modern biblical criticism and or historical criticism as we would have it today and apply it strictly to these books. Like this book had a different meaning than just straight history, how we would define it now.
That's right. It was written to form people into a certain kind of folks. And most scholars think that the former prophets came together as a unit probably sometime during the Babylonian exile.
Okay.
At the earliest, because obviously you can't write the Book of Kings until the last event happens. And so Jerusalem has the fall, so they're in exile. You think about then that audience that was reading the first book in the former prophets, Joshua. And what are they reading? They're reading about a group of Israelites who desire to enter into the promised land, and they're giving examples of how that group of Israelites failed in some ways and is faithful in other ways. Well, here you got a group of people that are in exile in Babylon hoping to return to the promised land. And in some ways, their situation is analogous. So it really helps us to understand why these books were written and when they were written, and to see those four books as a unit.
That's great.
Wow.
Well, so can you give me a couple of examples of things that you noticed because of thinking of them in that way that we might think of differently?
Well, a couple of things that come to mind. One is pretty powerful. In our Bibles, the order of the books is different from what we see in the Tanakh, the Jewish arrangement. Okay. So in the Tanakh, it's Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. We, in our Bible, in our Protestant Bibles, we've got another little book inserted between Joshua and Samuel. And it makes sense why it's put there, because that's where, the book of Ruth ends with the genealogy of David. So it makes sense chronologically to fit there. But it does interrupt the flow of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and could prevent us from seeing some connections that I think are important connections. For example, the last judge that we read about in the book of Judges is Samson. There's an epilogue, a long epilogue at the end of Judges that makes up the last chapters, but the last judge we read of is Samson. You can compare the birth narrative of Samson in Judges chapter 13 with the very opening chapter of Samuel chapter 1, and the birth narrative of Samuel. And the connections there are stunning. And it would be easy to miss some of those connections if you just go from reading Judges to the book of Ruth. That material is not going to be quite as fresh in your mind as it would be if you've gone straight from reading Judges to the book of Samuel. So you see, both those narratives start out by saying there was a certain man and then we're told that his wife is barren in both cases. Then there's a miraculous intervention, and the wife promises to devote her son to God. So both Samuel and Samson are Nazarites, devoted to God.
Yeah.
Well, if you've just read the story of Samson and you saw how he did not take his Nazirite vow seriously at all.
Right.
I mean, I don't know why.
How things ended up for him, right?
That's right. Why in the world we put Samson on T-shirts and celebrate him? I'll have no idea. He's a horrible guy. He's a skirt chaser. He's terrible. So, that his whole story is written in such a way to make it clear that he breaks every one of the Nazirite vows.
Right.
So that's the last story you read about a judge in the book of Judges. And then Samuel opens up that way. And you think, I know how this story goes. And it doesn't end well because it sounds the same. And then suddenly there's a turn.
Yeah. Okay.
And you end up with a strong contrast between Samson, who had no interest in really pursuing God and fulfilling his Nazirite vow, and Samuel. Notice the similarity between their names.
Sure.
Samuel, who was so devout, so devoted to Yahweh, kept his Nazirite vow, and so you really only understand the Samuel story, of the story of the prophet Samuel.
That's interesting.
If you've got in the background the story of Samson and Judges. And so that close proximity of those books, and to see them as a unit, to understand this material was written to be read together. Like you would, like you'd read Lord of the Rings. You don't just read the Fellowship of the Rings. You got to go through all 3 volumes to get the whole message. And that's how these 4 books were intended. But we don't even view them as a unit typically.
Right.
And we don't see them as in some way being prophetic or theological. We view them more as history. And then we've got Ruth inserted in the middle that kind of breaks the continuity, even though it does make sense chronologically.
Right.
This kind of reminds me of Luke Acts, that we've got John smack dab right between Luke and Acts, and those go together like it's this one continuous story. And I have never heard what you just said, that
was
Samson,
good. That's interesting.
Samuel thing. It's kind of blowing my mind right now to think about that there's the continuity that, again, just to order the Bible or how we have our Bible, just how that breaks that narrative, and to see that connection is, it's amazing.
Yeah,
awesome.
And we don't know exactly when this ordering took shape for the Jews.
Sure.
But it's pretty early. And my guess is that if you were to ask the New Testament Christians, what order are you reading these texts in, it would probably be much closer to the Tanakh arrangement than anything that we read today. So again, it's the same scriptures, just the order is different.
I think we get hints of that in the Gospels, for example. That there are hints that they're using those orderings that are different than ours. Ours, really, I guess I'm thinking now. This is just off the top of my head. It's really not until we get to the Vulgate, right, that we begin to get the ordering that we have, right, the Latin translation of the Bible.
That's right.
So
that's right. Okay. Yeah, and you're right. In the Gospels, Jesus will often say things like, he'll refer to the law, the prophets, and sometimes he says the Psalms, which is the first book in the writings. So to say biggest, Psalms is kind of the shorthand way of saying the writings. So he refers to those 3 units of the Tanakh. So I think that's what he would be familiar with. And they would read those 4 books, the former prophets, as a unit. And so when you come to Samuel, it's really, really helpful to put it in that context.
Well, I'm like Ryan. I had never thought of it. As soon as you said the parallels of Samson and Samuel, I'd never heard that. But then you're like, oh yeah. I mean, it seems so obvious after you point them out. I mean, that's great, good stuff.
And for me, also thinking in Babylonian exile, like this narrative of faithfulness, not faithfulness, and painting this picture of these people longing to come home, back to the promised land. It's
and the whole story starts there with a people who've just come out of exile, are heading into the promised land, but then you get to see all their mistakes along the way. And so the Israelites in Babylon are obviously supposed to learn the lessons and not make the same mistakes.
That's good. Yeah, I've always seen Judges kind of as from an exile perspective, kind of like, well, here's how we got here. Here's the problem with how we got here. But I like that it's kind of saying also here's how we can re-enter. Here's the things we need to think about when we go back into the Promised Land. So
yeah, that's a great way to think of it. I think something else that's really interesting about seeing these 4 books as a unit is recognize the heavy influence on these 4 books that comes from the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, sometimes the former prophets are sometimes called the Deuteronomistic history.
Right.
And they're referred to that way because Deuteronomy has such a heavy influence. It's almost as if whoever wrote these 4 books just finished reading the book of Deuteronomy and then said, okay, now I'm going to record a history of Israel from the time of Joshua up until the time of the fall of Jerusalem for these people in Babylon. And just a couple of things come to mind there, but the blessings and the curses in Deuteronomy sort of lays out this idea that if Israel is faithful when they enter into the land, they will prosper and it will go well.
Right.
And if as a people they reject me, then they will fall under the curses. Well, that's exactly what unfolds in the history.
Right.
Yeah. But relative to Samuel, the place where it really shows up is in the book of Deuteronomy. We find instructions and guidelines for all of Israel's officials, judges, priests, prophets, and kings.
Kings,
right?
Yeah.
And
even though there aren't any at that time.
Even though there aren't any, they're anticipating that they will. And of course, Samuel the prophet fulfills the role of judge, priest, and prophet. He really holds all of those. The one position he doesn't hold is king.
Right.
And then he anoints the first 2 kings.
Sure.
But the guidelines for the king back in Deuteronomy chapter 17 are fascinating. There are 3 or 4 prohibitions and then 1 positive admonition, and that material really shapes the way that you read the account of David and Saul in the book of Samuel.
Huh. Okay. What are do you remember those prohibitions off the top of your head? I'm sure you do.
One is they can't be a foreigner, so they have to be an Israelite to be king. They can't accumulate too many wives. Yeah. And the question is, well, how many is too many? But the issue
I'm not going to answer that.
Yeah, no,
I'm not going to say 1. That's
yeah. I don't know. I don't know how many. I do not know how many angels sit on the head of a pin, and I don't know how many wives is too many. But the point there is, that's not a prohibition against polygamy. It's a prohibition against acting like a pagan king, because the pagan kings commonly, one of their signs of their power was they accumulated a huge harem.
Yeah, and political connections, right? Through the political marriages. And,
and so that that really comes into focus in the story of Solomon. But it's obviously important as well for David. Yeah. So anytime you read that David, takes on another wife or 2, you kind of raise an eyebrow and think, okay, is he getting close to whatever too many is?
Right.
So one is don't acquire too many wives, and you're right, that relates directly to political marriages.
Sure.
They're relying on treaties with others and arrangements with other tribes and groups and nations to secure their own power. And the second one is don't accumulate a lot of horses. And it's not that God hates horses, but what he's prohibiting there is military might.
Military power,
Yeah, horses pull your chariots, and the idea is trust in God, not in your own military strength.
Right.
And then lastly, don't accumulate a lot of wealth. Well, all of those, lots of political marriages, military strength, accumulating a lot of wealth, all of those have to do with trying to find some kind of source of security and strength other than Yahweh. And so that's the primary concern. So the question is, are the kings are really called to trust in God?
Right.
Are they going to do that or are they not? And then the first two kings, it's a study in contrast between Saul, who repeatedly does not put his faith in Yahweh, and David, who repeatedly does, even though David, from time to time, blunders significantly. Ultimately, he puts his trust in God. And then the last command in there is actually a positive thing that the king is instructed to do. He's told to write down a copy of this law and keep it and read it daily so that he can lead the people well and he won't think too highly of himself.
Right.
Well, I mean, when you read the story of Saul and Samuel shows up and asks, well, where is Saul? This is after Saul has committed one of his great sins. And the people say, he's gone off to build a monument to himself up at Mount Carmel.
Right.
Where's he putting his trust? And is he thinking of himself a little too highly? Well, yes. And that goes all the way back to Deuteronomy, and where you get this picture of this is what the ideal king should look like.
Right. Interesting. It's good. I like that. Yeah.
That's interesting how this all plays together. You know, like this whole, the Deuteronomy informing so much of what we see, the strong connection, all this stuff. And then again, how this all plays out, especially reading this as the prophetic, thinking about where it sits historically, looking back, but then looking forward at the same time. Like, how do we live once we come back in the land out of Babylonian exile?
Right.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned the prophetic lens again. Some of what these prophets are doing is showing how prophecy, in a sense, was fulfilled in the kings. So in Deuteronomy, you have the guidelines for the kings. Well, what does that actually look like when it's played out? Well, in Saul's case, it looks like this. In David's case, it looks like this. Like this is the fulfillment of the blessings and the curses.
Right.
This is the fulfillment of the instructions as they were played out in the lives of people. So it's not so much predicting that things will happen as much as saying, this is what God said would happen if you did this, and if you did this, here's the historical record that shows you that's exactly how it plays out.
Right. It reminds me, you talked about and I wasn't thinking about the kings, although it's very interesting what you're pointing out here. I was thinking about back in Deuteronomy where it says, when you go into the land, do not give your daughters to their sons to marry, do not give your sons to, and then the beginning of Judges, it's almost exactly the very things that, and it's almost a verbatim quote from Deuteronomy. That's what I was thinking about. They gave their sons, in marriage, and they worshiped their gods, and, that's the issue. That's the problem that they had.
Yeah, all kinds of connections between Deuteronomy and the former prophets and the other prophetic books as well. Again, you read Jeremiah or Isaiah, and it's like they just finished reading Deuteronomy, which isn't surprising because from the Jewish perspective, Deuteronomy is the most important book because it's Moses' interpretation of the law, and Moses is the first and greatest prophet. So we're not even surprised that when Jesus goes into the desert and is tempted by Satan, he quotes scripture, and all three quotations come from Deuteronomy. Because like a good Jew, he's out there meditating on Moses' interpretation of the law. So in some ways, this isn't surprising, but the connection between Deuteronomy and these four books is particularly strong.
Interesting. Let me go back to, so like I said, I thought in those terms. So this connection you're giving me with the kings, I hadn't really thought of in this detail, but we got to talk about marriages, and I'm even thinking about, help me remember David's first marriage is Michal. Is that his first wife? Okay.
That's right.
And she's a daughter of Saul, right? Is that the connection? And so they're. Even that has a political. I never thought of it in those terms, but it's not just a marriage, in a God pleasing sense, right?
And if you read the Samuel narrative carefully, good grief, if you pay attention to what's going on with Michal, there are some subtle clues that are dropped that make that one of the most tragic and interesting stories. And a lot of it relates to this idea of her playing the role of a political pawn.
Yeah. And again, I'd never seen that until you just said that, but I'm sitting there thinking, that was a political marriage, really. I mean, that's really what's going on there. So,
and we come to the end of the story where David's dancing as the ark comes in, and Michael is bitter and despises him. But if you read her story closely, you understand why she's in that place. Because she's been played clearly by Saul, but maybe by David to some degree too.
Yeah. And he doesn't seem, and I know that there are people who make something different out of that narrative, but I've looked at that one and listened to some pretty interesting scholars on that that's not something to be, his dancing in his underwear is not something to be glorified at all there, and especially when you see what's said after that about the maidens and all this kind of stuff that he's kind of flexing his muscles a little bit there, so. Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
So that kind of material from Deuteronomy really influences the reading, and it just reminds us too that the Old Testament texts were written to be meditated on and reread again. In fact, sometimes they're referred to as Jewish meditation literature, and the idea there is that they're written in such a way where the more you read and the more you become familiar with the stories, you start to pick up on these earlier echoes and allusions and even direct connections that you simply do not see the first or second or third reading.
Sure.
But you meditate on it and you start to see these things, and then the text just comes alive.
That makes sense, yeah. It reminds me, you mentioned, Ryan, earlier, the Luke Acts, but it also reminds me, I do a lot of narrative study of John. Gospel of John's kind of my area. And when you pointed out Samuel and Samson being laid side by side, it's the same kind of thing that John does when he, for example, has the woman at the well laid right next to, this Jewish religious leader who comes to him at night, and they're a clear contrast, and their stories have similarities, but yet they end up in completely different places. So, even just thinking about the way that these stories are structured, I think are important to, as we think about the Gospels and other, narrative literature. So.
And it happens within literary units like the Gospel of John. And it also happens between literary units. Yeah. And especially in the Old Testament, the biblical authors are very aware of the earlier writings, and they play off of those earlier writings. We call this intertextuality. It's when an earlier story is used to inform a later story. And you're supposed to interpret the later story through the lens of what you know from the earlier story. But maybe the classic example of this would be when you come to the story in the book of Judges, where you have the story of the Levite and his concubine.
Yeah. Toward the end.
It's a horrible story.
Horrible story.
And they go into the city. Yeah, it's sometimes called a text of terror, but they go into the city. And there's an old Ephraimite man. The city's in the town of Benjamin, or in the tribe of Benjamin. So it's Benjamite Israelite territory, right in the heartland. There's an Ephraimite who's living there in the land, and he takes them into his house. And right in the middle of their meal, a bunch of men, the wicked men of the city, the text says, come and bang on the door, and they say, send out the man so that we can have sex with him. Well, immediately when you read that story, you're supposed to think of an earlier text.
Sure.
You're to think of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Gomorrah. Yeah.
That's right. And the language is even identical at certain points.
Mirrors,
so that you can't miss it. And the conclusion you're supposed to draw is that the Israelites have themselves become like Sodom and Gomorrah now.
Right.
And so you only understand the text you're reading in its fullest sense if you really appreciate and hear and know about the earlier text and the way those details connect. And Yeah, I like to illustrate it this way. I don't know if you guys are Avengers fans, Marvel fans at all.
I am. I watch them.
I don't have enough time to understand it all, but I like the movies. But then somebody will point out what you're about to do. They'll point out the connections, and I'm like, oh,
yeah. I've been sucked way too far into the MCU. I don't like this. I don't like the Phase 4 stuff too much. But the first three phases I thought were great. And Ryan, you'll remember that great scene in Endgame, where Thanos has just beaten Thor down, and Captain America's been beat up, and Thanos is about to kill about to kill Thor, and suddenly the camera pans over and you see Thor's hammer lifting up. And then it goes flying by, and it's not going to Thor, it goes to Captain America, Steve Rogers. And when that happens, we watched this on opening night, the theater just erupts. Well, why do they erupt? They know the illusion that comes from a movie, 7, 8 movies earlier, wherein there's this little scene where all the Avengers are sitting around at a party at Tony Stark's house.
Trying to lift the hammer.
They're trying to lift the hammer. And there's this one little scene where Captain America tries to lift it, and you get this little squeak, like he gives it a budge. And Thor kind of gives this look. It's like, oh, wait a minute. I'm supposed to be the only one that lifts that hammer. It's like a 15-second scene, but then they pick that up 7, 8 movies later, and you make the connection so that you're understanding the current scene in light of the earlier scene, and the audience just goes nuts. Well, that's actually what's supposed to happen when we read our Bibles. We read these stories and we make the connection, and we're supposed to go, oh, this is, I never understood it in this way. I see it now. I get it.
Right.
And so good storytellers know how to do this.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Well, I tell you what has been, I keep going back to this, what it is really, but understanding the purpose of why it was written and seeing them as prophetic, like, again, Babylonian exile, I think it's like a whole new lens for us as we go back and read this in the church to go, Joshua, Judges, Samuel and Kings, like kind of going, this isn't just history, but like see the connections. Like for me, like as we've read and as we've had conversations about stuff, once you start to see the purpose and you see the connections, it brings a whole new life to it, where I'm not just reading history. I'm not just reading good things and bad things, but I'm reading a narrative that is telling a very compelling message. I've always thought of it like, yes, this is the story of God, but even to the people then as they are reading these stories, what this narrative is doing to them is, and that knowing that purpose really helps me as I'm digging into Scripture as well.
Yeah, and I think something that helps my students, Ryan, is when I tell them when you look at one of these texts, you always want to ask yourself, what's the dramatic date? When did the events happen? But then also, what's the composition date? And oftentimes there's a big distance between those two. And so if you read it from just a purely historical perspective, you can kind of get bogged down in the dramatic date and read it through the lens of, this is written to Joshua or to the people in the period of the Judges, and no, it's written from a much later time and for a different purpose. And so to put ourselves in that era of the composition date and to understand all 4 of these books, I think there's some first-person accounts in Joshua and Judges, but the collection, those 4 books as a unit, probably didn't come about until the time of the exile, and then that just puts a whole new light on what you're reading.
We've talked about that a little bit before with even the Pentateuch, because again we go back to the narrative time, the story time, but then you think about, well, these were written, if these are written by Moses after the Exodus, it gives you a different perspective. Even I've mentioned this with the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, the first commandments are all about don't worship other gods, and you're coming out of a polytheistic context. That's all they really ever known as a people. After Joseph and the family moved down, Jacob, but then they're going into a place where that's the warning there. They're going into a polytheistic nation, and the warning is you need to get rid of these other people and the gods that they worship, or you're going to fall into this worship yourself. So that's why we have this command.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things we forget sometimes is that Scripture was written to the Israelites that were living in this culture that was polytheistic. There were no atheists. They all believed in gods. The problem was they believed in lots of gods.
Yeah,
and the question,
or they believe this guy.
And they, the question is, which God do we worship, and who's the one true God? And understanding that context makes all the difference in the way you read those narratives.
Your God may have been fine out there in the desert, but this is the God that we worship here in Canaan. That kind of an idea.
That's right. So that's right. Yeah.
So thanks for this. These have been fantastic. Was there something else you wanted to say about Samuel, or is that pretty much what you had in mind to talk about? Did you have another example?
There's a lot more we could say, but we don't have all day. All day. So
Well, let me say this. I mentioned earlier, you've got and I want to hear a little bit about your idea behind these retreats. You've got a couple of retreats, or several retreats now you're doing a year. A couple of them are learning retreats, and then you have a spiritual formation kind of retreat. So just tell us about what you're doing there and what your ideas are about it.
Yeah. Well, those are really designed to give me an opportunity to pour into Christian leaders. And I've really felt a calling to do that. And the two retreats are a little different. One's called the Spiritual Formation Leadership Summit. And it's a 2.5-day retreat that I hold at a retreat center in eastern North Carolina, or eastern Tennessee. But we're adding one in North Carolina this spring. So I actually do those 3 times a year. And I do 3 of them so I can limit it to about 50 participants. We don't want it to become some big thing, but they kept filling up, so I keep adding them. And those retreats really emphasize the retreat dimension, but there's some pretty solid content, and I try to bring some graduate level kind of content that is on some topic relative to discipleship and spiritual formation. And most of the folks that attend that are on church staff, and they're there first to nurture their own soul so that they're ministering from the overflow. And they recognize they need to be there. But then secondly, the kinds of things that we talk about in the workshops can be applied in their ministry context so that they can think outside of the box about how to more effectively form and disciple the people in their care. So we kind of follow a monastic rhythm. We get up and we have morning prayer and worship, and then we eat a meal together, and then I teach for a while, and then we go off and spend some time in silence and prayer, reflecting on the teaching. We come back and debrief it, and then we worship midday and have another meal, and we just kind of follow that rhythm. I think some of your listeners have, I know some of your listeners have attended the summit.
That's how we got your name. They're like, you got to talk to this guy.
So that's been fun. Those have been going on for 9 years now. And it just continues to grow, mostly through word of mouth. I don't really do any advertising. So that's always encouraging when people bring their friends.
Yeah, let me ask you this. You say Christian leaders. So, like, who is a Christian leader? Does that mean is it just for pastors, or who can be a part of this?
It's probably about 75% church staff. But we have chaplains, both hospital and military chaplains that attend. We have campus ministers. We have nonprofit leaders who are leading different kinds of organizations. And then we always have a handful of lay folks, sometimes elders, but maybe somebody that teaches a Sunday school class, and they just realize they need to take some time to grow closer to God and get some new content that they can share. So usually about 20-25% are folks that are not on a church staff somewhere. Missionaries, we frequently have missionaries, sometimes Christian counselors, and spouses are invited to that. So a lot of times, a staff person will bring along their spouse so that they can grow together. And some pastors bring other staff members, so they use it like a team retreat. And then other pastors want to get away from their team, and they come by themselves.
What are you talking about?
Well, I could see value in both, depending on the situation, the time.
That's right. Yeah. So that's the summit, and then out of the summit, about 3 years ago, I had this idea. I was recognizing that really good pastors understand the need to continue to learn, to be lifelong learners.
Yeah.
And many of them have done some grad school. But there comes a point where there's no more grad school to do, and graduate school is expensive as well.
Sure.
So I got to thinking, how can we offer, college level, graduate level kind of instruction for people that want to continue to be lifelong learners so that they can keep filling up and spill over into the lives of their people. And then I got to talking with some other church leaders and different professors around the country, and we started to realize this phenomena that more and more churches are hiring staff internally. And these internal hires, most of the time, are hired not because they have any formal training at a Bible college or a seminary, but they're just hired because they love Jesus and can do something well, which is great and outstanding. And you know their character and you know who they are because they've been in your church. What's missing is the biblical and theological training. And the reality is most of those folks are not going back to college. So I was praying about this, and I thought, why don't I just recruit some really good college professors from around the country to teach their signature courses in a 5-day retreat intensive. And it's not for credit, which means you don't have to take any tests or write any papers. But you get the same content that you would if you were attending like a 5-day graduate intensive course.
Sure.
And because there's no homework or assignments, we found that it really changes the dynamic of the teaching, and it becomes much more transformative and much less transactional, because nobody's there to get a grade, to earn a grade, or earn a diploma. They're just there because they want to learn, and because they want to keep growing in the faith. And the cool thing about it is you get to eat meals with the professor. We have times of worship and prayer. There's more time carved out for reflection. So instead of taking a test, we can spend an hour praying over the material, reflecting on it, really to let it sink into our soul. And so we started these about 3 years ago. I did the first one on the Psalms, and that was just a lot of fun. We've done 3 more since. This past summer, Dr. Mark Zeiss, who taught at Cincinnati for a long time.
He's been on the Bistro, guest of the Bistro.
Yeah. He taught this past one, which was on land and text. And of course, he was great to, his experience in the land and with being an archaeologist. We looked at how understanding the geography and archaeology and topography of the land impacts our reading of the text. I'm doing the next one actually on the book of Samuel this spring. And it's March 27th through 31st. So it's 5 days.
Okay.
We meet at Country Lake Retreat Center, which is a really nice retreat center operated by Southeast Christian Church in Louisville. And it's just, they've got a nice lodge there. So we have nice facilities. And again, we start out the day with prayer and worship. And I do some longer blocks of teaching, but we carve out some time for reflection and more worship. And it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So, if you like this episode, the content you've already talked about, they should check out the retreat, right?
Yeah. And we have a lot of folks that I would say the vast majority of folks that currently come actually have graduate degrees. We had one participant last time around who had his doctorate, but he just wanted to come take a deep dive into the minor prophets. But we have a lot of folks, lay people, that are drawn to this one too. People who realize they're never going to go back to a Bible college, but they would like that level of teaching. And they really appreciate it in a context where there's pastoral care and concern. And they know, they can have conversations with the instructor, and nobody's trying to earn a grade. And but the pastors who come, for the most part, they're coming and using this time to prepare sermon series. And so, and that's a lot of fun to teach some content, and then throughout the year, these pastors get back in touch with you and say, well, here, I'm preaching, working through Amos now. We did a study on the minor prophets. I'm in Hosea. What do you think about this?
Right.
This is how this is going. So it's a lot of fun to see the immediate application of what you're bringing poured back into the lives of the local congregation, which is a whole different dynamic from training people who one day are going to be ministers. You're sitting down with people who are hungry and want things that are not only good for their own soul, but they can take back to their people in an immediate kind of way.
Right. And I will say, I'm going to say generally, I went to Bible college and I did music, but I had a minor in biblical studies. But just I, as someone who is not in full-time ministry and doesn't have the advanced degrees like you two, I can attest to the benefit of sitting underneath someone like you, Jody, or Brian, or someone else, like to have that, just as you've kind of showed us today, like, how long would it have taken for me to uncover anything of what you said to us today? I've been in the church my whole life, and to sit underneath someone who studied this and looked at these things is such an invaluable resource, even as I lead a small group, as I have conversations, as I'm working to disciple others. Like this kind of information is so important, I think, for the church that we can each, even though we may not be full-time professional, PhD or advanced studies, but that we can know the word and that we can clearly articulate it and help our people and the people that we have influence on do the same.
Yeah. And one of the cool things about the learning retreats is I only invite professors who actually have experience serving on a church staff. Because I want them to be able to teach through that lens. They have to be, experts in their field, but I want them to be able to see how this applies to life in ministry and life in the local church. And so this material, while it's academic in one sense, it's really taught through that pastoral lens. And I think that makes a huge difference as well. And Brian, I think that makes it a little easier for lay folks to wrap their mind around it and see, here's how this can apply in my small group or my Sunday school or wherever you might use it.
It's one thing to be smart. It's another thing to be smart and to be able to teach it. You know what I mean? It's like that. If you're super smart, but you can't help that information be absorbed by others. It's it's only for you. And so that's great. To translate academia into real life ministry in the church is so valuable and needed.
Yeah, so we mentioned earlier at the outset, we're planning on going to this retreat. Ryan and I both. We're planning on, hopefully, an episode will come out of this, of the Bistro down the road, and we're excited about digging in. Even more excited after hearing what you shared with us today, Jody. That kind of thing. Going back, Ryan, you keep talking about the prophetic nature of these books, but Jody, also what you said that these were to be formative. These were intended to form the community of Israel, and I like what you're talking about with this retreat. It seems like it's the same kind of thing. These are stories that are meant to have impact on the way that we live as followers of Christ, as God's people. And so, I'm excited about that, spending some time with you, getting to know you a little bit better, and spending some time learn more about David. So,
I think that'll be a lot of fun. And one of the things we do, I try to have some guided reflection exercises, and some of that is designed to take us to do some reflection on our own life and to see how this text speaks to us before we ever take these texts and try to teach them to anyone else.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, very cool. So give me the dates again. That's March
it's March 27th through March 31st. So that's a Monday through a Friday. We start on a Monday afternoon. We wrap up around noon on Friday. And the lodge there at Country Lake's really nice. They feed us well. The evenings are free, so you can go kayaking or hike around the lake there.
Oh,
wow. So that's nice. And
that's cool.
Yeah, I hope maybe some folks will listen to us or join in with us.
And if they're wanting to get a hold of you, how's the best way to find you, Jody?
Yeah, well, they can find out more information about the learning retreats and the Spiritual Formation Leadership Summit on my website. And it's just my name, Jody L. You have to remember the L, JodyLOwens.com. JodyLOwens.com.
I'll put a link to it in our. If you're on Facebook, you can go on Facebook and find a link to it, or you can go to our website and we'll have a link to it there as well. So they can click right there and get information about your retreat and hopefully sign up, because this has been great.
Yeah, you could come I don't know if this is. You can come and see Ryan and Brian face to face if you want to. I don't know.
We're trying to recruit people to go, not.
That's what I was thinking.
Jody wants people to go, not to be driven away from us.
No, we're very much looking forward to it, and I do think it'll be a good time of learning. So
yeah. Jody, thanks so much.
Yeah, that a couple of really great insights that I'll be thinking about for the days and weeks to come for sure. And appreciate your taking your time and spending here with us in the Bistro today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, and I really appreciate everything that you all are doing to try to bring some really good, rich content to folks and just nurture the soul of your listeners. So I appreciate what you all are doing and pray for you as you do that.
Well, thank you. I think we have some very similar goals in terms of what you're doing with the educational learning retreats and what we're doing here. So it's all about trying to emphasize God's people and build them up. That's what we're really about. So
that's right.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks so much, Jody and Brian. I will see you next Tuesday. And were you going to say something about the video? Oh, you were going to say something else. No, never mind. I'll see you next Tuesday. Don't worry about it. Yes, well, I'll see you next Tuesday. All right. See you. Bye, Jody.